All right. There we go. Microphone. All right. That should be, whoa, that's a little too loud. Okay. Okay. All right. What do I got here? Got some questions. Okay. What do I think a Victorian child would be most shocked about in 2025? I mean, what wouldn't they be shocked about? I think would probably be the better question. You know, hygiene, cars everywhere, you know, the magical supercomputer in your pocket, which would probably be basically incomprehensible to a Victorian child. To be like, I don't understand what that's supposed to be, but it's pretty awesome, right? Like, honestly, everything. I mean, my dad was not a Victorian child. He was born in 1947, and still occasionally, like, he tells me stories about what life was like, you know, in the 50s when he's growing up, and I'm just like, wow, the world is entirely transformed. Okay. Goodbye. All right, so this question, where... Interesting question. Okay, where are the readings listed for each week, right? So on the last page of the syllabus, if you're watching online, you won't be able to see this because I'm not switching my inputs. But, you know, the last page of the syllabus, or the last page or so, is a lecture schedule, right? And over here, I'll put my drawing feature on, right? On this side, you know, are the readings. And you'll just kind of have to match up the list with what's up here, right? So that's the bibliography is starts here, right? Course materials. But if you go, and here some of you are probably like, oh my God, we know. But since someone asked, I'll just point it out. Canvas. Don't judge how many classes I have, please. Where's 377? That's how many classes I'm teaching. Thank you. So you thought your life was hard. In general here, which I should probably change to readings, right? All of our readings here are listed here, and you can find the appropriate one, right? So our first one was Postman. It's right here. They're in no particular order. The second one, right, that Haywood reading is right there. They're in no particular order, but you should be able to find them without too much difficulty. Okay, huzzah. If I could go back in time and show a Victorian child my phone, would I show a Victorian child my phone? If not, what would I show them? I have no idea. Like, I think it would all be entirely amazing to them. I think the phone would make the least amount of sense. And then I would tell them what people do with the phone, and it's like they argue with strangers. But why? About things that don't affect either of them. But why? Okay. Yes, actually, I think by the Victorian period, we are getting much closer, though not quite there yet, right? We still have some child labor going on in the Victorian period, though it's getting solved, and we don't have a child welfare or justice system yet. But the idea is definitely coming, and it's a lot closer than it would have been, say, in the Middle Ages. Okay, so I thought I cleared that. There we go. All right. I'm feeling like I should have ignored the email from the chair on Friday that said urgent email, reply ASAP, because it ended up with me, temporarily teaching another section of SOC 100. So that's been my day, figuring that out. Okay, that's not your problem. That's my problem. All right, so we're talking on Friday, right? We're going through our kind of history of youth and childhood, and this is kind of Neil Postman's account of where it comes from, right? So we started talking through, the impacts, the kind of development, the fact that this is not necessarily a natural category, that it has some social elements to it, right? That, children aren't just those small people. They're only children for a certain period of time based on a whole bunch of things, economic and cultural imperatives. And we kind of worked our way, through the Greeks and Romans and kind of what they thought, and then into, through the Middle Ages, and really sort of now picked up with the impact of the printing press, right? This technology that fundamentally sort of transforms the West. And then, through the West, other parts of the world as the West's influence sort of spread out around the world. Now, I mean, they weren't the first ones to invent the printing press. The Chinese had invented the printing press quite a bit before, but for whatever reason, the technology never took off in China, but really took off in Europe. All right, and we ended off with this slide. And, this is, oh gosh. Okay, now we're in silly times. We'll ignore the sillier questions, right? To some extent, we'll have some fun. Right? These were Postman's 3 conditions for childhood or the development of childhood, right? A notion of shame, right? Some things are beyond the pale, right? Some things you cannot talk to children about or it is shameful, right? And this is usually, sex, politics, economics, war, and that sort of thing. You need literacy because there needs to be a kind of hierarchy of knowledge, things that adults know that children don't have access to through written knowledge. And, to teach literacy, you need school. Okay. Let me see here. Okay. Are the readings, okay. I feel like they would have had pickles. It's not like canning's a new technology. Oops, I cleared that question by accident. We'll talk a little bit about the war, right? We'll talk a little bit about particularly the silent generation, a little bit. I'm not going to tell you if I could own a child from any era. That's such a silly question. Okay, are the readings mandatory? No, but they're going to be really helpful when it comes to doing the exams, right? You could probably get by, but again, when I show you sort of the level of detail that I want for, if you're looking for, because every question's out of 10, that 10, 9, and into 8, the readings are going to be really helpful. And, they're not super long for the most part. Okay. Mostly the lectures, the readings can be helpful. But, I mean, am I going to ask you a really boutique question like on page 15? No. I'm not going to ask you for some really, really specific information that could only be found in the reading that you didn't see at all. I'm not going to do that because I don't believe in that. But again, they're there, and I think pretty interesting. Okay. All right, I haven't moved on to this slide yet. All right, so we're now at the present. Sorry, I'm doing recap and answering your boutique questions about slavery and children, which, I have some concerns about whoever asked that question, but okay. So, Postman's contention. This one's pretty obvious, right? Where literacy is high, there's schools, right? So, for instance, English literacy kind of surges ahead. England had a lot of schools, and so the English become literate relatively early compared to, say, some of their continental peers, France, Germany. The Russians, they're going to be way behind because they're still living in a feudal society well into the end of the 19th century, right? The Spanish and Portuguese, again, way behind the English in terms of literacy. Now, I think the more interesting contention is that where there are schools, a concept of childhood starts to develop. And this is kind of on the next slide, and I'll talk about it there. But the basic kind of thing here is that once you start to cluster children together in schools, right, you start to notice that children have these kind of unique characteristics, right? That they are different from adults, and you start to kind of catalog more and more of them. So, schools essentially, according to Postman, change the relationship of adults to children, right? And here, you know, he's leaning heavily on the work of a scholar that, you know, depending on where you're coming from, people either love him or hate him. His name is, you know, Philip Aries, who did, you know, a lot of the work on kind of medieval and early modern childhood. And amongst the things that Aries suggested was that there's this distinct change from the kind of Middle Ages to, you know, the early modern period in how children are represented, right? In the Middle Ages, you know, in art, children are mostly depicted as more or less the same as adults, right? They're wearing similar kinds of clothing, they're doing similar kinds of things. But when you get to, you know, the early modern period, right? So again, we're talking like the 17th century, right? We're talking this, you know, late 16th, early 17th century, right? So late 1500s, early to mid 1600s. They go from being sort of depicted as miniature adults, right? Doing all the things that adults would do and dressed in all the same ways. They're just smaller. And they start to resemble then more unformed adults, right? As we enter into modernity. So they are wearing different clothing, right? They are occupied by different things, and they start to be treated as young people that need to be shaped, right? And again, under kind of, you know, that medieval rule, childhood effectively ends sort of by 7 years old, at which point you are involved in the economy, right? Either you are working, I hate that these cameras lights are always on. Oh, there we go. Okay, either you're working, right? So you are apprenticing under a blacksmith or a miller or a cobbler or some other trade guild, you know, in the Middle Ages, or you're involved in farming, right? Agriculture, or if you're a girl, right, you're doing household tasks, cooking, cleaning, sewing, you know, and other kind of, I don't want to say domestic tasks, because at that point it's all about survival, but other tasks that are less physically demanding, the tasks that would have been assigned to male children. But you're not really a child, right? You don't have what we would think of as one of the keys of childhood, which is that delay from the adult world, right? You are involved actively in the economy at that point. Okay, now once we get schools, right, and literacy becomes key to entering the adult world, the period of childhood starts to get longer and longer. Why? Well, because in school, you're sort of shielded from the demands of the adult world. Now, again, as we move closer to the present, one of the things that happens with economies is they continually become more complex, right? And your ability to basically function in the economy is going to require more and more education, right? Now, you might not notice so much, say, in 1790, right? You maybe just need some basic literacy skills, which could probably be taught to you at home by your parents. But by the time you get into the 20th century, especially the middle part of the 20th century, to really do well in the economy, you're needing a considerable amount of education. So, again, you know, you're not going to notice it in 1440 when the printing press is invented. You might not even notice it in 1660. There has been a kind of a qualitative change. The number of years, even a quantitative change, the number of years of schooling necessary to succeed in the economy is growing, and it accelerates over time. And certainly by the 20th century, you know, you need considerably more, right? Probably a high school education at least. Okay. Now these are sort of more boutique-y points, and this relates to kind of Postman's sort of intellectual tradition. He's part of a school called media ecology, which I won't talk about here, but it's an interesting kind of school of thought. For him, right, what happens is learning changes. It goes from kind of relatively disorganized, you know, basically sort of a master teaching, a pupil, but not with like a curriculum or not necessarily in sequence, but as their abilities grow, right, they get taught more skills. Kind of like learning martial arts today. My son, maybe this is not typical, my middle son, he's 12, almost 13, he's in Taekwondo, and I don't know if it's just the person who teaches him Taekwondo. I wouldn't say it's the most structured curriculum. It's just kind of like as his abilities develop, he's taught another skill on top. But there doesn't seem to be any kind of universal, like I'm going to teach you this and then this and then this. It's just kind of like all over the place. And that seems a little bit more like, learning to be a blacksmith in the Middle Ages, right? But under literacy, everything becomes sequential and hierarchical, right? You learn your ABCs, and then you learn grammar, and then you learn, composition, and then you learn rhetoric, right? All of these things would be structured, or say in mathematics, right? You're going to learn basic addition, subtraction, then multiplication, and then algebra, and then calculus, and so on and so forth, right? And again, I've massively compressed how that works, but it's sequential and it's hierarchical, right? You need to master one skill before moving on to the other because they build on each other. And it's very ordered, right? It'll be like in grade 7, you learn X, and that's how learning becomes. The other thing that happens, and again, this doesn't happen all at once, and it doesn't happen equally in all places, but increasingly what you see in the literature on, say, education and pedagogy is that people start to develop a sense that students should be grouped by age, right? So where it's possible, especially in urban settings, right, you get, the idea of like a grade level, right? So you end up in grade 1 at roughly, keep triggering the hidden buttons at the bottom of the screen, at roughly age 6, right? And you're kind of assuming that all 6-year-olds have roughly the same abilities, roughly the same abilities to learn similar skills and all of these sorts of things based on their age, right? And you move people up according to age rather than according to ability, right? So it doesn't matter, maybe you're that one weird kid that enters first grade able to read Harry Potter. My mom was a teacher for a long time, my wife is a teacher. Certainly I've heard of kids like this that enter the first grade and they're already like savants in reading and writing. But under the system that we develop, we're like, well, that kid still pretty much belongs in grade 1 because other things like their emotional regulation, their need for physical activity is all based on their age, right? So we cluster kids by age because ability is seen as being tied to sort of physical development. Let me see if That's a really good question. Let me just read these really quickly. Okay, I'll answer. I'll answer these out of order. How important are key dates and years, or just a general thing? They're important-ish. But what I'll say is, again, you don't have to memorize them because everything in the course is kind of short answer, and it's open book, so you can look it up, right? So you don't have to memorize it. It's relatively important, but not, it's not the point, the whole point. Hang on, I'll use my mouse if I can find it. Mousey, where have you gone? All right, my mouse has vanished on me. Finger it is. We'll be looking at other societies' definitions and systems when it comes to children, or we'll be focusing on Western perspectives. For the most part, right, we will be talking about Western perspectives. Because there's a couple of reasons. It's the society we live in, so it's the most pertinent, right? And as we go through the rest of the course, we're really talking about the US and Canada in terms of youth. We have to draw some boundaries around things because otherwise, things are going to be different in what we still have pre-industrial societies in the world, right? Or industrializing societies. We have a lot of different levels of modernization or no modernization in the world. And so, we're just going to draw it around kind of Canada and the US, sort of the Anglo-American sphere, because, we can get a little bit over our skis otherwise trying to talk about everything all at once. What dates are given on the current slide? I don't know. Let me look at the current slide. Do these educational institutions have to be formal? Like, does a tradition of grandmothers teaching children things count as education? This is a really good question, because there's, as formal schooling is developing, you do have different traditions of education, and it's going to vary quite a bit based on things like class, right? And we'll talk about class, as we go forward. If you were taught, and again, like, it doesn't distribute evenly. Even, as late as the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, you would have had probably a lot of working class or poor kids who got really no formal schooling or very, very little, and there wouldn't have been any schooling at home. But you might have gone, out to the English countryside. I don't know if you've ever seen the show Downton Abbey, right? When you're talking about really upper class families like that from aristocracy, they wouldn't have gone to school either. They would have had, for the males, a tutor. I don't know why I said it like that. And for the girls, a governess, right, who would have taught them reading and writing. So there's varying kind of levels of this, and it varies broadly, by social class. Most people, middle class people, would have sent their children off to some kind of schooling, right? The English had this long tradition amongst the upper and middle classes, of boarding school for boys, which is where you get to traumatize all the future royalty. If you've watched The Crown, you kind of have a sense of how Charles was traumatized by his time at, I can't remember the name of the boarding school he went to. It wasn't Eton, because Eton is in London. But you have this tradition of kind of English boarding schools, right, where they would send their boys off to be educated. But again, it really, really varies by social class, by time and place. Grandmothers teaching things, if they're being taught to read, yes, and you do see this, say, how far back should I go? I don't know. Let me write something. If we go back to 1517, right? 1517 is a really important date, because that's the date of the Protestant Reformation, right? October 31st, 1517, Luther, nails his 95 Theses to the cathedral door in Wittenberg, and kind of inadvertently starts the split of Western Christianity into two branches, Catholicism and Protestantism. The Protestants really focus on at-home education, and one of the things that Luther writes in his catechism is that it's the responsibility of parents to teach their kids how to read so that they can read and interpret the Bible for themselves. So there's a ton of variability, oops, I went the wrong way, in terms of time and place, and thoughts, and the ability of people to actually do this. Because if you might be a German Protestant in 1680, but if you're amongst the peasantry, right, you're probably not teaching your kids to read and write because you don't know how, and even if you did, you're too busy, farming, trying to survive, to actually teach them to read and write. So if you can, you might send them to a school, and if you can't, they're still involved in work. I hope I answered that question. Okay. This current slide. I don't have dates on this current slide. Just think of this as this right here. I have 1440 and 1660. Maybe I should write in yellow. Maybe it'd stand out more. Okay. So according to Postman, as we continue along this process, right, as we continue to put kids in school, as we continue to teach them to read, as we notice that they are somehow different than adults, they have different needs, their intellectual capacities are different, all sorts of things about them that we notice just by clustering them together and sort of thinking about them, thinking about how to educate them, thinking about how to give them the skills to function in this new world that print is creating, we start to, all sorts of things start to happen, right? Okay, so some of those things, right? We start to get youth cultures emerging, or specifically cultural products that are aimed specifically at children, right? So prior to 1744, right? And again, this is already, 300 years, after the invention of the printing press, 304 actually, after the invention of the printing press, you get the publication of the first children's book, right? And specifically, we think the first children's book published was this one, The History of Jack the Giant Killer, which has been republished over and over again. This is not, the original one. But this is the first book specifically written for and targeted at children that we have a record of, right? So we start to get culture that's aimed specifically at children. We start to get things like a categorization of children's language as being different, right? We start to realize that children speak in different ways, use different vocabulary, and we start to catalog that and write for it, right? So children's books will use the kind of language that children speak. And for some reason, when I was saying that, the image of Bluey jumped into my head. I don't know why. Okay, Postman makes this kind of claim: when any group is formed on the basis of a characteristic, in this case, age, it's inevitable that other characteristics will be noticed. And so people start to think about children more, right? So you get, by the end of the 1500s, the 16th century, children's clothing as a separate kind of type of clothing becomes the norm, and you get the notion of play clothing for children, right? That they, especially in the upper classes, that children will have their nice clothes and then like their school clothes, and then they'll have play clothes. And then you get things like books on pediatrics, right? So books on medicine specifically about children. And the first ones are published sometime prior to the beginning, of the 17th century, so prior to 1600. So you see all of these things sort of slowly rolling out as people start to think of children as a different thing. Okay. I'm much more interested in, I discussed this at a point way earlier. I discussed this years ago in this class, and I've sort of taken it out and replaced it with talking exclusively about smartphones because, I need my folk devils. No, I joke a little bit, but I think the conversation around phones is a lot more interesting. But yeah, it's something quite interesting. It's an interesting point. Definitely, at a certain point, you definitely have media for kind of teens and tweens where the characters no longer resemble teens and tweens in any way. And here I am always thinking of Riverdale for some reason, as much as I'd rather not. I did watch almost every episode of that show with my wife. After a while, it became just hate watching, like laughing at it every single week. I'm like, where are the adults? Why are these children in a high school in the middle of the night? What is even happening here? Why are they constantly having sex all the time? Even though the statistics suggest that teenagers have less sex than ever. Anyway, I had questions about Riverdale, but certainly the characters on that show were like mini adults, right? They talked like adults, they acted like adults. Well, really dysfunctional adults, but let's not dwell too much on Riverdale. Okay. Oh, Riverdale. I miss you and don't miss you at the same time. Okay, so what else happens? I don't know why that circle was there. So you start also to see, and here we're probably talking, again, we really start to see this in probably the 18th and in the 19th centuries, right? We start to see more modern family forms starting to emerge, right? So what you might think of as the nuclear family, right? Mom, dad, and kids, rather than something like an extended family, right, where you would live like multi-generation. Is it Friday? I'm tripping over my tongue like it's Friday. It's Monday, isn't it? Multi-generational families would have been the norm prior, right, where you would have lived in these extended family units with grandparents, aunts, uncles, and all this stuff. Increasingly, as you move into modernity, the nuclear family starts to emerge, right? And again, this is not going to emerge all at once, and it's not going to emerge evenly between classes. It's going to emerge much more quickly in the upper and middle classes than it does in other kind of socioeconomic groups. Okay, part of this, according to Postman, and I think he's right, results from the need to create a longer period of schooling, right? So what you get is you get kind of family units splitting off. They become more, economically viable because of some changes. And particular tasks like educating the children falls to one parent, right? Usually the mother. And parents will play a greater and greater role in being educators. Now, again, this happens more quickly and more consistently in Protestant societies than it does Catholic ones, right? Catholic societies like France, Italy, Portugal, Spain lag behind here, places like the Netherlands and particularly England by a significant measure. All right, the other thing that happens, and that's really important to the creation of kind of nuclear families, is you get an emerging middle class in England, right? And if you remember, Intro to SOC, or even probably your social studies from high school, somewhere in the middle of the 18th century, you get our good friend, the Industrial Revolution. I'll just write IR. And this changes things pretty fundamentally. Now, some of the wealth growth in the middle class starts before that in what Marx will call primitive capitalism or accumulative capitalism. That happens in, say, the colonial period. But by the Industrial Revolution, you really get a big growth of middle-class merchants, most notably in England, right? England is really far ahead here. And they use some of that extra wealth that they're generating through, factories and trade and all of this fun stuff to build larger segmented homes, right? And if you remember that one of the things in the Middle Ages that had happened is everybody lived in pretty close quarters. The creation of segmented homes leads to a growth, and I have this on one of the next slides, but I'll say it now. The growth of a notion of the private sphere, right? Things that are supposed to be private, right? Or, put another way, things that if they get revealed will end up causing shame, right? So you get a notion of the private sphere, right? So there are rooms specifically for children, right? And there are rooms for adults, right? So think about it this way. I don't know if I never know how many people have seen like Peter Pan, right? The Disney movie Peter Pan. A few head nods. One of the things that's kind of notable in Peter Pan, right, is that Wendy and her brothers inhabit the nursery, right? The children are in a special room in this kind of middle-class English home called the nursery, right? Where the kids go, and that's supposed to be their space. Now, the conflict of the story and what leads the children to, attempting to flee to the land where children are children forever is that Wendy, who's, obviously on the cusp of puberty and therefore, kind of adulthood, is being told by her parents that it's time to grow up and leave the nursery, right? So that's, part of the plot of Peter Pan. But the nursery is for kids. Now again, if you've ever seen period pieces, that look at kind of the late 19th, early 20th century, there's another space, and one that's, typically, like Downton Abbey does this. There's a space that's specifically reserved for men, and it's sometimes, like the study or the smoking room, right? And this is where, I have too many things on my slide, I'm sorry. The smoking room. And this is where men will go to talk about all those shameful things, right? So after dinner, all the men will get their cigars and brandy and go off to the smoking room where they talk economics, they talk, war, they talk, sex probably, all of these things, the news, right? And all these things that are associated with men at the time. But you get, a private sphere, right? A sphere that's reserved just for adults, right? For adult conversation. And obviously the adult bedroom, right, is also one of these spheres, right? You're no longer sharing the bedroom with your children, so, sex becomes more private as well in that space. Okay, so those larger segmented homes allow for shame, and they allow for the creation of more of a private sphere where shame can sort of, be contained. Okay, or shameful things that women and children aren't, so children specifically, but then when it comes to politics and war and like, say, Downton Abbey, women aren't supposed to hear about those things either because it's a very sexist society. Okay, children also become objects of conspicuous consumption, right? Capitalism is genius for finding products that people want to buy, and so it creates, more varieties of children's clothing, toys, books, and all sorts of products for wealthier parents to indulge in buying for their children, right? Now, again, this point, which you've probably read already because you can read fast and I can talk, the middle class and the upper class can afford childhood. So it starts there, right? And it really only trickles down to the lower classes much later. And in a sense, it's not even an organic kind of process. Let me just clear this off for a sec. When I say it trickles down, it's not like kind of natural. What ends up happening, is our middle class and our upper class, upper class, they have children, right? They love their children, they dote on their children, they think of them in relatively kind of contemporary ways. And then they look at, the children of, the poor and the working class, and they're like, well, those are children too, but those children don't have the lives that our children do. And so they endeavor to basically sort of force their view of childhood down socially on the poor and working classes. And in the US, Canada, and the UK, this ends up being known as the child saving movement. And and you can thank the child saving movement for things like child labor laws. The youth justice system comes out of the child saving movement. So yeah, child labor laws, a criminal justice system that's aimed at reforming wayward young people, especially of the poor and working class. Child protective services, all of these things are essentially a function of a social movement that starts in the middle and upper classes that tries to force their vision of childhood down across everybody in society, right? So they universalize that view of childhood. And this sort of starts, after 1850, and it's largely complete by about 1950. And at that point you've got, compulsory public schooling, where children are expected to attend, school at least until, it's a little bit earlier in the 1950s, but today it's until their 16th birthday, right? Before they can drop out of school. Because essentially a bunch of do-gooders in England, the US, and Canada decided that their vision of childhood had to be forced on everybody, and all of the things that they saw as good for children, they sort of universalized and created systems to deliver even to those people who couldn't afford it, right? So thank you, child saving movement. Although it obviously has some flaws, and if you've taken SOC 321, Youth Crime and Society, you'll hear about some of those flaws. Okay, so a lot of what happens, right, because of print, is adults come to control the symbolic environment of the young, right? Through literacy, through the education system, through kind of control of books, right? What books young people are allowed to read, what's considered appropriate, what kind of themes are covered in children's books, right? Adults control the symbolic environment of the young. And we still see versions of this kind of thing today, right? The Alberta government is currently attempting to take certain books out of school libraries. Specifically, again, this is a function of controlling the symbolic environment of the young, right? Saying there are some things that are just not appropriate for children of certain ages to know about, right? And they're like, these books contain themes not appropriate for children, get them out of school libraries. And then librarians practice a form of vicious compliance, and it's all good fun to watch. So the transition from childhood to adulthood is one that is controlled by adults, right? Again, through things like the school system. You learn, those knowledges that sort of slowly induct you into adult life as they're released to you. As your literacy level grows, you're able to access more of that knowledge. Okay, so children evolve, according to Postman, towards adulthood by becoming better and better readers, right? And, you gain skills, and this again is sort of his view of media. He thinks that the things that print sort of creates in people is different kinds of qualities. So you're different from, say, a medieval person because print has imbued you with a sense of individuality. He suggests this is largely because you interact with books on a one-to-one basis, right? Logical and sequential thinking, because the printed word is logical and sequential, right? You have to build arguments. You have to tell stories in a certain order, unless you're James Joyce. That's neither here nor there. Higher order abstraction, right? A lot of the things that you're going to see when you read are things that don't exist or that you haven't directly experienced. And so you kind of have to imagine them. So think of I don't want to overuse this example, but think about picking up the Harry Potter novels, right? You've never been to Hogwarts, I don't think. Maybe. But you can kind of imagine Hogwarts, right? And you've probably seen the movies, so that's the image of Hogwarts you have in your mind. But let's say you hadn't, right? You could imagine what Hogwarts is like because you have this ability to abstract from these descriptions to an image inside your head. And that is what print creates, is the ability to abstract outside of your concrete experience to, these broader experiences, right? You can imagine, I'm trying to think, the castle of Elsinore in Hamlet, right? You can imagine, Raskolnikov walking through St. Petersburg in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment without ever having been there, right? You can imagine the Hunger Games, even though you've hopefully never been in a battle royale where you tried to kill other children. Hopefully. So higher order abstraction. Delayed gratification, right? It takes some time, right? And this is one of the complaints that people have, about Gen Z, that, your attention span has been so nuked by TikTok that you lack the ability for delayed gratification. So novel reading is way down. I don't know if that critique is fair, but that's the idea, right? You have to be patient. You have to wait for books and stories to play out. You have to be still and sit there. Okay, and what happens, as print becomes the basis of adulthood, and it becomes the basis of functioning properly in a modern economy, ultimately learning becomes an intellectual and moral pursuit. And you are if you don't send your kids to school, if they are not properly educated, you have committed some kind of, moral failing, right? You are a bad person for that. Okay, how am I doing for time? So amazingly good. I have so many 6 minutes left. I'm going to check for questions. Whoa! I am aware of this. I think KJ Appa now is 32. He's still playing teenagers. It really bothers me. Okay, what dates? Oh, I cleared that. Cleared that. Some components of child, society, adult kids rooms because, okay, that's a silly question. Reincarnation is not a sociological concept, except in sociology of religion. What do I mean by learning becomes intellectual pursuit? Okay, it becomes intellectualized, right? So learning as opposed to, say, being kinetic, right? So something that you would have done to learn a particular skill. Now it becomes something that's much more abstract, right? You're learning, as I said, you're learning grammar, right? So it's not, in a sense, practical. It is intellectual. You're learning rhetoric, right? So you're learning how to make arguments. You're learning, mathematics, right? Arithmetic, algebra. These are more intellectualized than kind of practical and grounded. And so that's the kind of learning that people start to do. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. All right, now I have 4 minutes. That's okay, because I talked about some of this already, so I can go through this slide really quickly. So we get really, as childhood develops and as we get, again, closer to the modern age, and here, think, the Victorian period is a really, really good kind of period to think about this. So we're thinking about kind of the 19th century. You start to see more ideas about public and private spheres, right? So there's public knowledge, things that can be discussed anywhere in front of anyone, and then private knowledge, which things that need to be kept. I'm sorry, it's not inherently funny. It's just kind of funny. I always imagine when that sound happens that something in the university has fallen apart, because that happens every day. Private knowledge, what needs to be kept secret from some. Typically, children and women are the ones who need to be protected from certain information in this kind of social setting. And only when you are deemed adult enough are you actually let in on those secrets, right? Again, your information environment is controlled so that things aren't written, let's say you're talking about war, you're talking about sex, you're talking about politics and whatever, it's written at a level that most children wouldn't be able to fully understand. Okay, and shame returns as a really important category. And you see it in Victorian society in particular, right? The Victorians were notoriously prudish because they were really, really worried about shame and what was shameful, right? Sex, politics, war, economics, and all of those things. And always, you learn under the supervision of teachers and parents. And we still kind of live in that world, right? Okay. So, with the coming of industrialization, again, I already said this a little bit, we see a really strong split between upper and middle class who have children and the lower classes who don't. And then as we get, to the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries, this notion is forced down on those people, right? Ultimately, I think for the good of children, but it still is, the upper and middle class is taking their view of what children are and should be and what childhood should look like and forcing that down on social classes who can't afford it, and then creating institutions ultimately to support that. Public education being number one, but child welfare, a youth criminal justice system, and all of these things also being really, really critical. Okay. So I would say yes. So the answer is, would women at the time be considered less adult? Like, would a boy child who's mature be more adult than a grown woman? In some ways, right? There's also a lot of sexism, right? The idea that women, just can't handle certain things, that they're the gentler sex or the fairer sex. And so there are some things that are only meant for rugged, large muscled men or something, people with mustaches who drink scotch. So there's gendered patterns in there as well. Oh, I think it's more kind of cultural norms of the time, but thank you for clarifying that you didn't mean they'd done something bad in their past life. Okay, why don't we leave it there, because I'm out of time. We'll pick it up here, and we'll talk about some ideas that are important to childhood, and then on Wednesday, I think we'll be able to get through this and start talking about generations. Okay, should get off.